Woodrow Wilson, as I said, was elected in 1912. At the time, he had no idea that Western civilization was about to undergo its most horrendous conflict in history. In fact, everything appeared calm on the world stage in 1912, which is one of the reasons that Americans didn't ask what Woodrow Wilson knew about foreign policy, didn't ask what William Howard Taft, the Republican incumbent, knew about foreign policy, hardly asked what Theodore Roosevelt, who was the third-party challenger, knew about foreign policy. It was all about the economy, which it almost always is about. And for the first year of his presidency, Woodrow Wilson paid almost no attention to foreign policy. He was concerned with the domestic economy. He was concerned with tax reform. And he really gave hardly a thought to foreign affairs. Sort of like when President George W. Bush was elected and became president in January of 2000. I don't know if you're old enough to remember, but from January of 2001, when he was inaugurated, until September 2001, the Bush presidency was almost nothing about foreign affairs. Domestic politics was the principal concern of the new Bush administration. The Wilson administration expected that domestic affairs would continue to be the predominant theme, but then Europe went off and declared war on itself. The Germans and the Austrians and the Turks came in on one side, and the British and the French and the Russians came in on the other side. And Woodrow Wilson declared American neutrality. The United States takes no side in this war, he said. Wilson went beyond that. He urged Americans not even to root for one side or the other. We should be, he said, neutral in thought as well as in deed. And it looked for a while as though the United States might be able to stay out of Europe's war. Most Americans in 1914, we're now at the summer of 1914, most Americans in the summer of 1914 could trace an immediate ancestor, a parent, grandparent, maybe great-grandparent, to one of the countries that were at war in Europe. The United States was then, as it is now and as it always has been, a nation of immigrants. But the percentage of immigrants in the United States in the early part of the 20th century was higher than it had ever been before or has been since. And this is one of the reasons that Wilson cautioned Americans, don't root for one side or the other. Naturally, people who had come from Germany might be rooting for the Germans. And people who had come from regions of the Austrian Empire might be rooting for the Austrians. People who had come from Russia might well be rooting, well, they'd probably be rooting against Russia, because the reason they left Russia is they didn't like it in Russia. But anyway, people did have an emotional stake in the outcome, and Wilson said, please, don't let your emotions get engaged. Because Wilson realized if the emotions did get engaged, then it wouldn't be long before American armed forces got engaged. Why? Because Wilson did understand that American domestic politics has a very large impact on American foreign policy. This is a democracy. If people want war, they're going to get war. Now, Wilson knew that most Americans at first didn't want war, but interest might arise that would pull the United States into war. I asked a moment ago, why the war in Iraq? What was the altruistic part? Democracy for the Iraqi people. What was the self-interested part? Oil. Oil wasn't a big deal for the United States in 1914, because in 1914, the United States was a major producer of oil, far more than it was a consumer of oil. But in 1914, there was an equivalent economic stake, and that was American investment. The United States, you may or may not know today, the United States is a major importer of foreign capital. Lots of money is coming from foreign countries into the United States, but in 1914, the United States was a major exporter of capital. And the United States, that is, American banks, loaned money to the various belligerents in the war. Now, what this meant was something similar to what it would mean if the United States lost control of oil from the Middle East. If the countries that the United States loaned money to lost the war, the United States wouldn't get, those lenders wouldn't get their money back. So there was a very large economic interest in ensuring that the countries to whom the United States loaned money did not lose the war. The loans went overwhelmingly to Britain and to France, who were on the same side in the war, which gave the United States an incentive to make sure that Britain and France didn't lose the war. Woodrow Wilson, however, was very reluctant to lead the United States into war. He was old enough to have lived through the Spanish-American War. He saw how the enthusiasm for war against Spain had dissolved when the war turned out to be more complicated, as the casualties rose and the difficulties of suppressing the insurgency in the Philippines had led Americans to turn against the war. So Wilson decided that if the United States was going to go to war, it was going to go to war very slowly. And Wilson was going to try to educate American public opinion, American political opinion, to the necessity of American intervention. He took his time. The war started in the summer of 1914. As late as the autumn of 1916, 2¼ years later, Wilson was still saying he was not going to send American boys to fight a war. In fact, his campaign slogan, his re-election campaign slogan in 1916 was, "He kept us out of war." So Americans went to the polls in 1916 and voted for Wilson, in large part on grounds that he had kept the United States out of war. I said earlier that there have just been a small handful of elections where foreign policy played a major role. This was one in 1916. And what did Wilson do? Well, it wasn't entirely his doing. It was the doing of the German High Command. Even before Wilson could be re-inaugurated, he won by a hair's breadth in 1916, but even before he could be re-inaugurated the following March, the German government decided, in effect, to declare war on the United States, because the United States had become a de facto ally of Britain and France. And it was at this point that Wilson went to Congress and asked for a declaration of war. This part is important, because when McKinley asked for a declaration of war in 1898, when Wilson asked for a declaration of war in 1917, when, I'm going to get to my third president in a moment, when Franklin Roosevelt asked for a declaration of war in December 1941, in each case the president followed the rules specified by the Constitution. Do you know which branch of government gets to declare war? Congress. Congress declares war. That's what the Constitution says. Do you know the last time Congress declared war? 1941, after Pearl Harbor. Congress has not declared war since then. Does that mean the United States has not been at war since World War II? The United States has been at war in Korea, in Vietnam, in the Persian Gulf, in Iraq. But Congress didn't declare war in any one of those cases. We can talk a little bit more about why that's so. But the point here is that Wilson allowed American public opinion to prepare itself for war. He took 2½ years to get the United States into the war. Congress, by the way, did give him his declaration of war. It was a split vote. It wasn't by any means a slam dunk. It was strongly in favor of war, but by no means unanimously. So there were enough people in the United States who wanted, is this really such a good idea? Is this our war? But a majority of Americans thought it was. American troops went off to fight.